Today we have a story about a woman whose quiet strength changed everything and uncovered a horror that had been sealed inside the walls for decades. This is the recovered account of Grace Holloway, housemaid, written in her own hand during the autumn of 1859. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. From the private journal of Grace Holloway, discovered in a tin box beneath the floorboards of the old Whitmore Estate, Millbrook, Connecticut. The pages smell of lavender and ash. I write this account while memory serves and while my hand can still hold a pen without trembling. What happened at Whitmore Estate in the autumn of 1859 must be set down, lest it be forgotten or dismissed as local gossip. I am Grace Holloway, 34 years of age, widowed these 5 years past, and I swear before God that every word here is truth. I came to Millbrook in September, seeking work after my late husband's debts consumed what little we had. The town was small but prosperous, built around the lumber mill and the estates of men who had made their fortunes in timber and trade. I found lodging at Mrs. Kemper's boarding house and took in mending work. But winter was coming and I needed steadier pay. It was Mrs. Kemper herself who told me of the position. Mr. Cornelius Whitmore, owner of the grandest estate in Millbrook, required a housemaid. His previous girl had left suddenly, no explanation given, and he needed someone reliable, clean, and respectful of station. The pay was generous, $2 weekly, plus room and board in the servants' quarters. He's particular, Mrs. Kemper warned me, folding sheets with sharp, practiced movements. Keeps things just so, but he's fair if you follow his rules. I met Mr. Whitmore on a grey Thursday afternoon. The estate sat on a hill overlooking the town, a 3-story manor of white clapboard and black shutters, surrounded by old oaks that seemed to lean toward the house as if listening. Mr. Whitmore received me in his study, a tall, thin man of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair combed severely back and eyes the color of winter slate. "You come recommended," he said, not rising from his desk. "Mrs. Kemper speaks of your character." "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity." He studied me for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I require order in my household, Miss Holloway. Absolute order. Every room has its routine. Every task has its proper time. I do not tolerate deviation." "I understand, sir. Do you?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, but something in it made my spine stiffen. The previous girl thought she understood. She left in the middle of the night without so much as a word. "Most irregular." I said nothing. He continued, "You will rise at 5. You will clean the east wing before breakfast, the west wing after. You will not enter the 3rd floor unless I specifically request it. You will not disturb the walls in any room. You will not open windows in the back hallway. You will not ask questions about the house's history." He paused. "Are these terms acceptable?" The rules seemed odd, but I had known wealthy men before. They all had their peculiarities. "Yes, sir, good. You begin tomorrow." He handed me a small leather book, a ledger of some kind. Inside were lists upon lists, tasks, times, methods. Each page was filled with his cramped, precise handwriting. "Follow this exactly," he said. "Do not deviate." That evening, as I walked back to Mrs. Kemper's to collect my things, I passed the town carpenter's shop. It was closed, windows dark, but someone had carved words into the doorframe. I had to lean close to read them in the fading light. "JB built true, CW paid false." The letters were old, weathered, nearly smooth. I did not know what they meant, but they troubled me nonetheless. The next morning, I moved into the servants' room, a narrow chamber beneath the eaves, with a single window overlooking the back gardens. The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural. No creaking boards, no settling beams, just silence, thick and waiting. That first night, I woke to a sound I could not name. Not quite scratching, not quite humming. It came from inside the walls, soft and rhythmic, like something breathing just beyond the plaster. I lay still until it stopped. In the morning, I told myself it was only mice, but I did not believe it. My first week at Whitmore Estate passed in strict routine. I followed Mr. Whitmore's ledger precisely, dusting the parlor at 6, sweeping the entrance hall at 7, polishing silver at 9. Every task had its appointed hour. Every room had its rules. Mr. Whitmore moved through the house like a shadow, appearing suddenly in doorways to watch me work. He never spoke unless to correct. The curtains hang 3 inches from the sill. "Miss Holloway, not 2, not 4. The book's face spine. aligned to the shelf edge. You've missed a corner. I learned to feel his presence before I saw him, coldness that preceded him into rooms. The house itself was beautiful but strange. The walls were unusually thick, the rooms arranged in patterns I could not quite follow. Hallways seemed to curve when they should run straight. Doors appeared where I did not remember seeing them before, and everywhere there was that unnatural silence. On the 8th day, I made my first mistake. I was cleaning the morning room when I noticed a picture frame hanging crooked on the wall. Without thinking, simply trying to make things right, I reached up and straightened it. The frame was heavier than expected. As I lifted it, something inside the wall shifted, a soft sliding sound, like sand pouring through a narrow space. I froze, my hands still on the frame. Mr. Whitmore's voice came from behind me. "What are you doing?" I turned. He stood in the doorway, his face perfectly calm, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the doorframe. "I apologize, sir. The picture was crooked." "Yes, it's meant to be." I stared at him. "Sir, everything in this house is exactly as it should be. Miss Holloway, I do not require your improvements." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and tilted the picture back to its previous angular, clear 7 degrees off level. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "I wonder if you do." He leaned closer, and I smelled something sharp on his breath, not alcohol, something medicinal. "The girl before you straightened things, opened windows, rearranged furniture to improve the flow," she said. "She lasted 3 weeks. I meant no harm, sir. Harm is not always intentional." He stepped back. "Do not touch the walls, Miss Holloway. Do not adjust anything. Do not seek to understand. Simply obey." He left without another word. That evening, I studied the morning room more carefully. Every picture hung crooked in the same direction. Every piece of furniture sat at odd angles. The room looked wrong, deliberately wrong, as if arranged to satisfy some pattern only Mr. Whitmore could perceive. I thought of the sound inside the wall when I lifted the picture. That sliding, settling sound that night. The noise in the walls returned. Louder this time. Not scratching, not mice. Something else. A low, collective humming that rose and fell like breath. It seemed to move through the house, traveling from room to room along paths I could not trace. I pressed my ear to my bedroom wall and listened. The humming grew louder, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. A single, soft tap against the plaster. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. That as if something inside the wall was tapping back. I pulled away and did not sleep again that night. The next morning, I found dead wasps on my windowsill, 7 of them, arranged in a perfect line. Their bodies were old, dried to husks, as if they had been dead for years. But I had cleaned that sill only. Yesterday, it had been empty then. The dead wasps multiplied. Each morning brought more on windowsills, in corners, beneath furniture, always old and desiccated, always arranged in lines or circles or patterns I could not interpret. I swept them away without comment, as Mr. Whitmore's ledger made no mention of insect removal. The rules grew stricter. New pages appeared in the ledger, inserted between existing ones in Mr. Whitmore's cramped hand. Do not hum while working. Do not open doors quickly. Do not walk heavily on the 3rd floor landing. Each addition seemed designed to keep the house unnaturally still, as if any disruption might wake something sleeping. I obeyed, but the obedience felt increasingly wrong. In the 2nd week of October, a delivery boy came with supplies from town. His name was Thomas Bailey, a young man of perhaps 18 with an open, honest face. As I signed for the delivery, he glanced past me into the entrance hall. "First girl to last a month," he said quietly. I looked at him sharply. "I beg your pardon. Working here. Most leave within weeks." He lowered his voice. "My grandmother knew the carpenter who built this house, man named Joseph Barnes. He's been dead 30 years now, but she still won't speak his name." "Why not?" Thomas glanced toward the study where Mr. Whitmore worked behind closed doors. Something happened between him and Mr. Whitmore. Money owed, work disputed. Barnes claimed Whitmore cheated him, refused to pay for months of labor. Barnes died before he saw a penny. Heart gave out, they said, but grandmother claims it was rage that killed him. I remembered the carving on the Carpenter shop door. JB built true, CW paid false. What does that have to do with the house? Thomas shifted the empty crates in his arms. Grandmother says Barnes built something into these walls. Something he told Mr. Whitmore about before he died. Your house will remember, Barnes said. When the time comes, it will remember everything. Thomas met my eyes. She says this house is waiting. Before I could respond, Mr. Whitmore's study door opened. Thomas departed quickly, his cart rattling down the drive. Mr. Whitmore watched him go, then turned to me. "What did that boy say to you?" "Nothing of consequence, sir. Only small talk. I discourage fraternization with the townspeople, Miss Holloway. They traffic in gossip and old resentments." He paused. "Did he mention the carpenter?" The lie came easier than expected. "No, sir." He studied me for a long moment, those slate-grey eyes searching. "Good. The past is best left buried." But the past, I was learning, was not buried at all. It lived in the walls. That night, I woke to find my room full of wasps. Not dead ones, living insects that crawled across the ceiling in slow, drugged movements. They did not fly or sting, only crept in endless circles, tracing patterns in the darkness. I lay perfectly still beneath my blanket, watching them move. They formed shapes I almost recognized, letters perhaps, or numbers. The humming in the walls had returned, and the wasps seemed to move in rhythm with it, conducting some message I could not read. By morning, they were gone. Only their tracks remained tiny scratches in the dust that spelled nothing I could understand. I began to search the house during Mr. Whitmore's afternoon walks, not obviously, but with careful attention. I studied the walls, noting irregularities, patches of plaster slightly different in color, sections that sounded hollow when accidentally bumped, places where the wallpaper bubbled, as if something beneath had shifted. In the library, I found old account books from 30 years prior, June through November 1829, regular payments to J. Barnes, Carpenter. Then, nothing. The final entry read only, "Contract disputed. Payment withheld." In the margins, someone Barnes perhaps had written in pencil, "You will remember. The house will make you remember." The words had been partially erased, but remained visible in the right light. I was returning the book to its shelf when I heard footsteps in the hall. I stepped back quickly, but not quickly enough. Mr. Whitmore stood in the doorway. "You seem very interested in old records, Miss Holloway." "I was dusting the shelves, sir. I apologize if I disturbed anything." He crossed to where I stood and took the account book from the shelf. He opened it to that final page, read the marginal note, and smiled, a cold, thin expression that reached nowhere near his eyes. "Joseph Barnes was a bitter, unstable man," he said softly. "He built poorly and demanded payment for substandard work. When I refused, he made threats, claimed he'd cursed this house." Mr. Whitmore closed the book with a snap. "Do you believe in curses, Miss Holloway?" "I believe in justice, sir." His smile vanished. "Justice is a luxury of the powerful." Barnes learned it too late. He left, taking the account book with him. That night, the humming in the walls became a roar, thousands of small bodies moving in unison, furious and trapped. The sound grew so loud I pressed my hands over my ears, but it seemed to come from inside my skull as much as from the plaster. Then, suddenly, silence. In the morning, I found a crack in my bedroom wall, thin as a hair, running floor to ceiling. And seeping from it, very slowly, was a single drop of honey. The crack in my wall grew wider each day. By the end of the first week of November, it ran the width of my hand, and the honey seeping from it had pooled on the floorboards, thick, dark, and smelling faintly of rot. I showed Mr. Whitmore, expecting alarm. Instead, he stared at the crack for a long moment, his jaw working silently. "Clean it," he said finally. "Daily, tell no one." "Sir, the wall is failing. The whole structure might be. Clean it, Miss Holloway. That is all." I cleaned the honey each morning, but more appeared each night, and with it came the wasps, dozens now, crawling from the crack in sluggish streams. They died on my floor, their bodies forming patterns I had begun to recognize, numbers, dates, the same date, repeated over and over. November 17th, 1820-9. I searched the account books again when Mr. Whitmore rode into town for his weekly business. November 17th was the date of the final ledger entry. The day payment to Joseph Barnes was officially refused. It was also, I learned from a brittle newspaper I found wrapped around old silverware in the cellar. The date Joseph Barnes died. Collapsed in the town square, they said. Heart seized up while he shouted at passers-by about the injustice done him. The article mentioned nothing about curses, but it noted, oddly, that several witnesses reported hearing a strange humming sound just before Barnes fell, as if a great swarm of insects had passed overhead, though the sky was clear. I was reading this article by candlelight in the cellar, when I heard Mr. Whitmore's boots on the stairs above. I folded the paper quickly and tucked it into my apron, but when I turned, he was already standing at the bottom of the steps. You seemed to spend considerable time searching for things. Miss Holloway, I was looking for polish, sir. The silver is fine. He descended the final steps. In the dim light, his face looked skeletal, eyes sunk deep in shadow. You know what I think? I think you've been listening to stories. I think young Thomas Bailey filled your head with nonsense about carpenters and curses. No, sir, I think you're beginning to believe this house is somehow occupied, haunted by the vengeful spirit of a man I wronged. He laughed a dry, bitter sound. Do you know how much I paid Barnes? Twice the agreed amount. He demanded triple, claimed the work was worth more than contracted. When I refused his extortion, he threatened me, said he'd built something into these walls, something that would emerge when the debt came due. What did he build? Madness, delusion, the desperate fantasy of a dying man. Mr. Whitmore stepped closer. There is nothing in these walls but plaster and timber. The wasps are a seasonal infestation. The sounds are settling wood. The honey is moisture seeping through old plaster. There is a rational explanation for everything. Miss Holloway, if only you'd stop looking for ghosts, then why the rules? I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them. Why must everything be kept exactly so? Why can't I straighten pictures or open windows? What are you afraid will happen if I do? His hand shot out and gripped my wrist not painfully, but firmly. I am afraid of nothing, but I know what happens when order breaks down. I know what chaos looks like. His voice dropped to a whisper. Barnes told me. You see, before he died, he told me exactly what he'd done. He said he'd filled the walls with nests, hundreds of them, sealed behind the plaster. Wasps, Miss Holloway, colonies upon colonies. He said he'd arranged them in a pattern, a structure that would hold for decades if left undisturbed. But if the balance shifted, diff walls were knocked, or windows opened, or the house disrupted, the nests would break open. All at once, I stared at him. You've known this for 30 years. I've maintained this for 30 years. Every picture hung crooked to redistribute weight. Every window sealed to prevent drafts that might weaken plaster. Every rule designed to keep those nests intact. His grip tightened, because Barnes was right. The debt has come due. The house is failing. The nests are breaking open. And if you do not follow my instructions exactly, Miss Holloway, we will both pay the price he intended. He released my wrist and climbed the stairs, leaving me in the cellar darkness. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the house above me, feeling the hum in the walls that was no longer imagination, feeling the knowledge settle like a stone in my stomach. Mr. Whitmore hadn't cheated Joseph Barnes, but he had fought the payment, delayed it, forced a dying man to beg for what he was owed. And Barnes, in his rage and desperation, had built a monument to that injustice. He had built a bomb, and it was finally detonating. That night, the crack in my wall split completely. Honey poured out in a thick stream, and with it came the wasps, hundreds of them, thousands, spilling into my room in a black, writhing mass. I fled to the hallway, slamming the door behind me. Mr. Whitmore stood at the end of the corridor, fully dressed, despite the hour. It's starting, he said quietly. From behind every wall in the house came a sound like thunder, the sound of 30 years of silence ending all at once. The house was waking up, and it remembered everything. Did not sleep that night. Neither did Mr. Whitmore. We stood in the entrance hall as the house groaned and settled around us, listening to the movement in the walls. The humming had become a roar, the sound of countless insects stirring from decades of dormancy. By morning light, the damage was visible. Cracks spiderwebbed across every wall on the second floor. Honey seeped from the plaster in dark streams, pooling on the floorboards. And the wasps emerged in slow, crawling masses, too cold yet to fly, but alive, undeniably alive. Mr. Whitmore moved through the house with frantic energy, nailing boards across cracks, stuffing rags into gaps. We can contain it, he muttered. We must contain it. But I had seen enough. This house is collapsing. Mr. Whitmore, you need to call for help. The constable? Or no? He whirled on me. No one can know. If word spreads that my house is infested, I'll be ruined. My reputation, my business, everything depends on appearances. Your life depends on leaving. I will not abandon what I've built. I will not let that dead man win. His eyes were wild now, sleep-deprived and desperate. You will help me repair this, Miss Holloway. We will seal every crack, contain every nest. We will save this house. You're mad. I am practical, and you are in my employ. You will obey." But I had already made my decision. While Mr. Whitmore worked frantically to shore up failing walls, I walked into town. The autumn morning was cold and bright, and Millbrook looked peaceful, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing in the square, everything normal and safe. I went first to Mrs. Kemper's boarding house. She listened to my story with growing horror, her hands clutching her apron. Wasps in the walls. She whispered, "Dear God, Grace, you must not go back there. I need to find proof of what Barnes did, something that will force Mr. Whitmore to act. Proof of what? That a dead man cursed a house. Proof that Mr. Whitmore knowingly maintained a dangerous structure, that he concealed a hazard that could harm anyone who entered." Mrs. Kemper studied me. "You're thinking of the town records?" "Yes," she nodded slowly. "Thomas Bailey's grandmother. She's the one you need to see. Eleanor Barnes lived in a small cottage at the edge of town. She was ancient, perhaps 80 years old, but her mind was sharp as she invited me into her parlor. The room was spotless, spare, everything in its proper place. On the mantel sat a single photograph, a stern-faced man with a carpenter's apron. "My son," Mrs. Barnes said, following my gaze. "Joseph, dead these 30 years, but I think of him every day. Mrs. Barnes, I'm working at the Whitmore Estate. I need to know what your son built into those walls." Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered herself into a chair. "He told me, you know, the night before he died, he came home and said, 'Mother, I've done something terrible,' but it was the only justice I could find." She reached into a drawer and withdrew a folded document-told paper, yellowed but intact. "This is the contract between Joseph and Mr. Whitmore, signed and witnessed. Payment agreed upon. $300 for 6 months of carpentry work." I read it carefully. The terms were clear and legal. Joseph completed every item listed. Mrs. Barnes continued, but Whitmore delayed payment, claimed the work was inferior, demanded repairs that were never in the contract. Joseph was a proud man, he argued, insisted on his rights, but Whitmore had money and standing. Joseph had neither, so he built the nests. He collected colonies all summer, wasps, hornets, yellow jackets. He built chambers in the walls. Hundreds of the man sealed the insects inside with honey and wax. He told me they'd survive for decades if left undisturbed. Dormant but alive. He arranged them in a pattern, you see, a structure. He said if the house ever fell into disrepair, Whitmore's pride ever faltered, and he failed to maintain. What Joseph built, the nests would break open. All at once. She looked at me with watery eyes. "My son built a monument to injustice, Miss Holloway, and he built it to last." "Did he tell anyone else?" "The constable Orr," he told Whitmore, "marched to that house the day before he died and explained exactly what he'd done. Said the only way to prevent it was perfect maintenance, perfect care. That Whitmore would have to spend the rest of his life preserving what he'd refused to pay for." Mrs. Barnes's voice hardened. "Joseph said it was poetic justice, that the debt would come due eventually, one way or another." I looked at the contract in my hands. "May I keep this?" "Yes, but Grace," she gripped my wrist, "leave that house. Whatever is happening now, you cannot stop it. My son built his revenge to be inevitable. People could be hurt. Mr. Whitmore is planning to host a gathering next week. Town officials, business associates, 17 people." Mrs. Barnes paled. "November 17th, the anniversary is." "Then it's too late. The house has been counting down for 30 years. When that date arrives, everything my son built will come to fruition." She released my wrist. "Joseph told Whitmore the date, told him to mark it and fear it. He said the house would remember, even if Whitmore tried to forget." I left the cottage with the contract folded in my pocket and a plan forming in my mind. I could not stop what Barnes had built, but I could ensure that when it happened, only the guilty would pay the price. Mr. Whitmore had maintained his house for 30 years, not out of care, but out of terror. He had built his entire life around avoiding the consequences of his own actions. It was time those consequences found him. That evening, I returned to Whitmore Estate. The house was darker now, shadows lengthening in the late November light. Mr. Whitmore met me at the door, his face haggard. "Where have you been?" "Walking, sir. Thinking." He laughed bitterly. "While you've been thinking, 3 more walls have cracked. The nests are breaking open faster now. I can hear them moving." "Miss Holloway." Waking up, I met his eyes steadily. Then perhaps it's time to stop fighting it." His expression turned cold. "What did you say?" I said perhaps it's time to let Joseph Barnes's work be finished, to pay the debt that's owed. Understanding dawned in his face in fury. "You went to that old woman. You've been conspiring against me. I've been learning the truth. The truth." He grabbed my arm, fingers digging in painfully. "The truth is that I built my life from nothing. I made myself respectable through careful work and precise reputation, and I will not let a dead carpenter destroy that." "Then cancel your gathering. Send the guests away. Face this alone." "Never." He released me with a shove. "Those men are investors, politicians, the foundation of everything I've built. November 17th will proceed exactly as planned. You will serve tea and maintain appearances. And if you speak one word about what's in these walls, I will see you ruined so thoroughly you'll beg in the streets." He walked away, leaving me in the entrance hall, but I had seen something in his eyes that gave me hope. Fear. Mr. Whitmore was finally beginning to understand that some debts could not be avoided forever. The house hummed around me, counting down to November 17th, and I began to plan in earnest. The days before November 17th passed in mounting dread. The house deteriorated rapidly now, as if sensing its appointed hour approaching. Entire sections of plaster crumbled away, revealing the honeycombed chambers Joseph Barnes had built. Perfect hexagonal cells filled with wasps in various states of dormancy. Some were long dead, dried husks that crumbled at a touch. Others were beginning to stir, awakened by the breach in their 30-year prison. Mr. Whitmore worked around the clock, plastering over exposed nests, reinforcing failing walls. But for every breach he sealed, two more appeared. The house was coming apart from the inside, and no amount of desperate maintenance could stop it. I spent those days carefully documenting everything. I sketched the layout of the nests, copied pages from Mr. Whitmore's ledgers, and wrote detailed accounts of his admissions about Barnes's threats. I wrapped these papers in oilcloth and gave them to Mrs. Kemper for safekeeping. "If anything happens to me," I told her, "make sure these reach the constable." She clutched my hands. "Grace, please, don't go back there." "I must. There are 17 people coming to that house in 3 days. They don't know what they're walking into." On November 15th, I visited the constable myself. He was a practical man named Robert Freeman, with a square face and skeptical eyes. I showed him the contract between Barnes and Whitmore, explained what I'd witnessed in the house. He listened politely, then shook his head. "Miss Holloway, I appreciate your concern, but what you're describing is a property maintenance issue, not a criminal matter. If Mr. Whitmore's house has an insect infestation, that's his problem to solve. But the gathering is on private property, by invitation. I have no authority to intervene." He softened slightly. "Look, I understand you're worried, but Mr. Whitmore is a respected businessman. If his house was truly dangerous, he'd cancelled the event himself." I realized then that authority would not help me. Men of Whitmore's standing protected one another, closed ranks against accusations from housemaids and dead carpenters. If I wanted to save those 17 guests, I would have to act alone. That evening, I composed 17 letters. Each was carefully worded, explaining that urgent structural repairs made the gathering impossible, that Mr. Whitmore deeply regretted the inconvenience, and that a new date would be arranged. I signed them with a passable forgery of his signature and addressed them to each invited guest. I posted them the morning of November 16th, knowing I had perhaps 24 hours before Mr. Whitmore discovered what I'd done. The house that day felt like a living thing in its death throes. The humming in the walls had become almost deafening, a constant, droning roar that vibrated through every floorboard. Wasps crawled from cracks in slow, purposeful streams, covering walls in black, writhing carpets. They still did not fly. The November cold kept them sluggish, but they moved with clear intent, as if following some ancient instruction embedded in their very bodies. Mr. Whitmore had barricaded himself in his study, surrounded by account books and legal documents, as if paperwork could protect him from what was coming. When I brought his dinner, he didn't look up. "They're coming tomorrow," he said quietly. 17 of the most important men in the county. Everything depends on tomorrow. "Mr. Whitmore, you must cancel. The house isn't safe. The house will hold. It must hold. I've given my whole life to maintaining appearances. One more day, Miss Holloway. Just one more day." I left without arguing. There was nothing more to say. That night, I barely slept. The humming had become words, or so it seemed. A low, rhythmic chanting that might have been my imagination, but felt like something more, like the house itself was counting down, marking the hours until its long-promised reckoning. November 17th dawned cold and grey. I rose before dawn and walked through the house one final time. The walls were collapsing in earnest now. Whole sections of plaster hung in sheets, revealing the true extent of Barnes's work. The carpenter had been brilliant and thorough. He had filled every cavity, every gap, every hollow space in the house's structure with his living time bombs. There were thousands of nests, perhaps tens of thousands, all waiting for this day. At 8 o'clock, Mr. Whitmore emerged from his study in his finest suit. His face was grey with exhaustion, but his jaw was set with determination. "The guests will arrive at noon," he said. "You will serve tea in the parlor. You will say nothing about the house's condition. Nothing, Miss Holloway. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly, sir." He studied me for a moment, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But he was too tired, too desperate, to pursue it. He simply nodded and returned to his preparations. At 11 o'clock, the first reply arrived by messenger. Judge Harrison regretted that he could not attend due to the postponement notice. He hoped they could reschedule soon. Mr. Whitmore stared at the message, his face draining of color. "What postponement notice?" More messengers came. Mayor Thornton, Senator Bradley, the banker, the shipyard owner, the railroad investor, all sending regrets, all mentioning the notice they'd received. Mr. Whitmore turned to me slowly. "What have you done?" "I saved their lives, and possibly yours." His hand moved faster than I expected, striking me across the face hard enough to knock me to the floor. I tasted blood, felt the sting of split skin, but I did not cry out. "You've ruined me," he whispered. "Do you understand? Those men will think me incompetent, unreliable. My reputation, everything I've built, is built on injustice," I said, climbing to my feet. "Joseph Barnes built this house. You refused to pay him. You let him die in debt and disgrace. And then you spent 30 years living in fear of the justice he promised." Mr. Whitmore's face twisted. He was a thief, he was a craftsman who wanted fair payment for honest work, and for that, he should destroy my life, my livelihood. He destroyed nothing, Mr. Whitmore. You did that yourself. All he did was build a mirror, a reflection of what you owed him, and today, that debt comes due. The clock in the hallway began to chime noon. The humming in the walls reached a crescendo, and suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard it, a soft cracking sound running through the house like lightning through clouds. Every wall, every ceiling, every surface where Joseph Barnes had built his revenge, fracturing simultaneously. Mr. Whitmore heard it too. He looked up, eyes wide with the understanding that came 30 years too late. "Get out," he whispered. "Come with me." "No, this is my house, my life. I won't run from a dead man's curse." The first wasps burst from the walls like a dark flood. The wasps came like a biblical plague, not in ones or dozens, but in thousands upon thousands, erupting from every wall in the house simultaneously. The November cold that had kept them sluggish vanished in an instant, as if 30 years of stored heat released all at once. The air itself seemed to warm and thicken, and the insects rose on sudden, furious wings. Mr. Whitmore stood frozen in the entrance hall, staring at the black clouds pouring from the walls. They moved with terrible purpose, swirling around him in tightening spirals. Not random, not chaotic, deliberate. "Run," I shouted, grabbing his arm. He pulled away. "No, this is my house. I will not be driven out by insects. They'll kill you." "Then let them." "I won't give Barnes the satisfaction." The first wasp struck his face, then another, then dozens more, landing on his hands, his neck, his exposed skin. He cried out, swatting at them. But for every one he knocked away, 10 more took its place. I stumbled backward, toward the door as the swarm thickened. The air became solid with wings, with humming bodies, with fury that had waited 3 decades to wake. Through the chaos, I saw Mr. Whitmore stagger, his face already swelling, his hands clawing at the insects covering his skin. "Grace." His voice was thick, desperate. "Help me." I hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct screamed to leave, to save myself. But I am not a woman who abandons others to suffering, no matter how well earned. I wrapped my shawl around my head and hands and pushed back into that black storm. The wasps landed on me immediately, their legs catching in the fabric, their stingers seeking flesh. I felt sharp pains as several found gaps in my protection, but I pressed forward until I reached Mr. Whitmore. He was on his knees now, barely visible beneath the coating of insects. I grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the door. He was heavier than I expected, his movements uncoordinated, but I pulled with all my strength. We were 3 feet from the door when the second wave erupted. The parlor walls exploded outward, and a fresh swarm poured through larger wasps. Hornets, perhaps, their bodies thick and armored. They filled the entrance hall like smoke, blocking the doorway, the windows, every avenue of escape. The cellar, Mr. Whitmore gasped through swollen lips. The root cellar underground. I half carried, half dragged him toward the back of the house. The swarms followed, but something strange happened as we moved. They parted slightly, creating a narrow corridor through their mass, as if they wanted us to reach the cellar. As if this had been planned, we stumbled down the cellar stairs into cool darkness. I slammed the door above us, hearing it immediately covered by the weight of thousands of bodies. The humming was muffled now, but still audibly a constant drone that seemed to come from everywhere. At once, Mr. Whitmore collapsed against the wall, breathing in harsh, wheezing gasps. His face was barely recognizable, swollen to grotesque proportions, covered in angry red welts. My own hands were burning, my neck and face throbbing where I'd been stung, but I'd gotten the better of the exchange. "We're trapped," he whispered. "We're alive. For how long?" He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Barnes planned this, don't you see? He knew I'd be here on this date. He knew I'd tried to maintain my reputation, host my gathering. He built this trap knowing I'd walk into it. You could have counseled, you could have faced the truth. The truth." Mr. Whitmore looked at me with watering eyes. "The truth is, I was a young man trying to build something. Barnes demanded payment I couldn't afford. I delayed, negotiated, tried to find a compromise, and he couldn't wait, couldn't trust. He built this revenge instead of seeking legal remedy. You had the power, the standing, he had nothing but his work. And now we both have nothing but this cellar, and the sound of his victory." He closed his swollen eyes. "Perhaps that's justice after all." We sat in silence, listening to the house die above us. The sounds were terrible: wood splintering, plaster crashing, the roar of countless wings. Joseph Barnes had built more than a trap. He'd built a dissolution, a systematic destruction that would reduce the house to its bones. Hours passed. The sounds gradually quieted as the swarms exhausted their fury or dispersed through broken windows. As afternoon light filtered through the cellar window, I climbed the stairs and cautiously opened the door. The house was devastated. Walls had collapsed entirely, revealing the skeletal framework beneath. Wasps covered every surface, most now dead or dying in the cold that finally reasserted itself. The beautiful parlor was rubble. The study where Mr. Whitmore had worked was gone. His papers scattered and destroyed, and everywhere was honey. It dripped from broken walls, pooled on collapsed floors, ran in sticky streams down the stairs. The sweet, cloying smell, mixed with the scent of rot and insect bodies, created a stench that made my eyes water. Mr. Whitmore climbed up behind me, leaning heavily on the wall. He surveyed the destruction with a strange expression, not quite grief, not quite relief, something between. 30 years, he said softly. 30 years of perfect maintenance, and it all came to this anyway. Because maintenance was never the point. The debt was. He turned to me, his ruined face attempting something like a smile. "You saved my life, Miss Holloway. After everything I did to you, you came back. I saved your life because leaving you to die would have made me as cruel as the injustice that built this house. Then you're a better person than either Barnes or I deserved." We made our way outside, emerging into the November afternoon like survivors of a shipwreck. The town constable was already approaching up the drive, along with a crowd of townspeople drawn by the sounds of destruction. Constable Freeman stared at the collapsed house in shock. "What in God's name happened here?" "Justice," I said simply. 30 years overdue. The investigation that followed lasted weeks. The structural damage was so extensive that the house had to be condemned and eventually demolished. In the ruins, workers found the full extent of Joseph Barnes's work. Thousands of nest chambers, all carefully constructed, all positioned to ensure maximum structural collapse when they opened. They also found documents, contracts, letters that Mr. Whitmore had hidden in the walls, evidence of other debts he'd avoided, other workers he'd cheated, other injustices he'd built his prosperity upon. Mr. Whitmore's reputation did not survive the scandal. His business failed within months. He left Millbrook the following spring, and I never saw him again. But before he left, he did one thing that surprised me. He paid me not just my wages for the time I'd worked, but a full year's salary, and a letter written in his careful hand. Miss Holloway, you showed me what I'd spent 30 years avoiding, that some debts cannot be postponed forever, that justice delayed is not justice avoided. Joseph Barnes built his revenge, but you showed me mercy. Perhaps there is a lesson in the difference. I hope I am not too old to learn it. I kept the letter. I keep it still, pressed between the pages of this journal. The house site remains empty. The town purchased the land but has never built upon it. They say wasps still nest in the old foundation, though they seem peaceful now, as if Barnes's fury has finally been satisfied. I stayed in Millbrook only long enough to see the house demolished. Then I moved west, to a small town where no one knew my story. I found work as a seamstress, made a quiet life, but I still remember November 17th, 1859. I remember the sound of 30 years of anger erupting all at once. I remember pulling a cruel man from certain death, not because he deserved saving, but because mercy should not be rationed like justice sometimes is. And I remember thinking, as I stood in the ruins of Whitmore Estate, that Joseph Barnes had built his revenge to last 30 years, but Grace, the kind I showed, the kind I'd been named for, that kind of thing could last forever. I am an old woman now, writing these final words by candlelight in a house much humbler than the one where my story began. 43 years have passed since November 17th, 1859. 43 years since I walked out of that collapsing house with wasps in my hair and mercy in my heart. I write this conclusion now because the world should know what happened after the parts I did not tell before, because I was still learning them myself. Mr. Cornelius Whitmore died in 1900 in a small boarding house in Pennsylvania. He never rebuilt his fortune or his reputation, but the landlady who found his body wrote to me. She'd found my address among his papers, and she said something I've never forgotten. He died peacefully in his sleep. On his nightstand was a Bible, and a letter, read so many times it was falling apart. It began, Miss Holloway, you showed me what I'd spent 30 years avoiding. Perhaps he learned the lesson after all. Perhaps it is never too late for that. Thomas Bailey, the delivery boy who told me about Joseph Barnes, became the town historian. He compiled a complete record of the Whitmore House incident, including my testimony and the physical evidence recovered from the ruins. His report is kept in the Millbrook Town Archive, though few know it exists. He titled it The Carpenter's Revenge, a study in the arithmetic of justice. Mrs. Eleanor Barnes lived to be 94 years old. Before she died, she visited me once, traveled all the way from Connecticut to my new home in Ohio. We sat on my porch on a summer evening, two old women who had witnessed the same terrible reckoning from different sides. Do you think my son was right to do what he did? She asked me. I thought for a long time before answering. I think your son was wronged. I think his anger was justified, but I think the revenge he built hurt him more than it ever hurt Cornelius Whitmore. Whitmore lived 30 years in his house. Your son spent his last days building a trap he'd never see spring. She nodded slowly. I've thought the same. All that brilliance, all that skill, he could have built beautiful things. Instead, he built one terrible thing. She took my hand. But you, Grace, you walked into that terrible thing and pulled mercy out. That's the part I wanted to thank you for. Not for saving Whitmore, God knows he didn't deserve it, but for showing that even in the middle of justified anger, there's room for something better. She died 3 months later. I attended her funeral, and at her request, I spoke briefly about her son. I said that Joseph Barnes was a craftsman who built things to last, and that his greatest work was not the house or the revenge, but the lesson they taught, that injustice, left unaddressed, builds pressure, that debts unpaid compound with interest, that the wasps in the walls will always, eventually, emerge. The Whitmore House site remains empty to this day. I visited it once, 10 years ago, when I returned to Millbrook for Mrs. Kemper's funeral. The foundation was still visible, overgrown with weeds and wild roses. And yes, wasps nested in the old stones, their papery nests hanging like lanterns in the ruined cellars. But they were just wasps, no longer symbols of revenge, no longer carriers of 30 years of rage, just insects, living their brief lives in the ruins of human conflict. I stood there for a long time, remembering the girl I'd been, the woman who'd chosen to go back into that black storm, because leaving someone to die, even someone cruel, would have made her cruel in turn. I think that's the real story here, not the revenge or the reckoning, but the choice made in the middle of both. The choice to extend a hand even when every wasp in the house was screaming that ISHOULDN, single quotes to. Mr. Whitmore once asked me if I believed in curses. I didn't answer him then, but I can answer now. No, I don't believe in curses. I believe in consequences. I believe in debts that compound when left unpaid. I believe that injustice, like wasps in walls, will eventually find a way out. But I also believe in mercy, in the small, crucial choices that break cycles rather than perpetuating them, in the possibility of grace, even in the ruins of justified anger. Joseph Barnes built his house to remember, and it did. It remembered every unpaid dollar, every delayed promise, every injustice Cornelius Whitmore thought he could avoid. But I remember something else. The moment I chose to pull that man to safety, the moment I decided that mercy was not a reward for good behavior but a choice available even in the presence of evil, that moment changed my life more than the collapsing house or the black clouds or the investigation that followed, because I learned something Joseph Barnes never did, that the greatest revenge is not to build a trap for your enemy, but to refuse to become like them, to meet injustice with grace, to answer cruelty with mercy, not because it's deserved, but because it's possible. And in a world full of wasps and walls and debts that compound in darkness, possibility is the only thing that builds toward light. This journal was recovered during demolition of a boarding house in Portsmouth, Ohio, June 1907. The final entry is dated 3 weeks before Grace Holloway's death. She was 77 years old, survived by no immediate family, remembered by her neighbors as a quiet woman who took in sewing and always paid her debts on time. The Millbrook town records confirm every detail of her account. The Whitmore Estate collapse of November 17, 1859 remains the worst structural failure in Connecticut history. 17 guests were expected that day. 0 arrived. 1 life was saved by a housemaid, whose name appeared on no official documents until this journal was found. The site remains undeveloped. Local children say if you listen carefully on November 17, you can still hear humming in the old foundation stones. But that is only a story. All of this is the truth. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. These forgotten accounts deserve to be remembered. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Until next time, remember, some debts are never truly paid, some walls are never truly empty, and some women change history simply by choosing mercy when vengeance would have been easier.